environmental journalist, and I believe that the environmental crisis is not an environmental crisis, but a human crisis. And as a human crisis, it's a crisis that we can only sort out by changing the relationships between us. It's not a crisis that we're going to resolve by switching to electric cars or improved seed varieties or renewable energy alone. To restore the earth, and that's what we now need to do, we need to start by restoring the relationships amongst each other. I'm going to be speaking today about a subject that for many people is quite a sensitive one, which is how we distribute wealth amongst our societies and amongst people. And it's important that we talk about that because a very fundamental dimension of equality is power. And power, no matter what we may tell ourselves about our democracies, is very much associated with wealth and with economics. By the way, I'm not going to be advocating for communism, though I am certainly going to be advocating for more sharing. So let's look at the costs of inequality. There's a pair of British epidemiologists, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, who've done a survey across the 20 countries of the OECD and across a whole number of other countries, and they've found very consistently that where you have higher inequality in a society, higher income and economic inequality, you consistently have lower educational achievement, shorter life expectancies, increased infant deaths, more murders, increased imprisonment, more teen births, less social trust, increased obesity. In South Africa, obesity is combined with malnutrition, which is weird and tragic. We have more mental illness in more unequal societies. We have reduced social mobility, even in countries like the United States, where part of the promise of the society is social mobility. And critically, for what I'm going to be talking about today, in countries that are highly unequal, we have very much reduced environmental concern. This graph shows us over here, we have countries that have a low income, and here countries that have high income. And the top of the graph is as inequality worsens, showing us how health and social problems worsen. Right down here, a highly equal society, other highly equal societies, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, we have low incidence of health and social problems. Far up to the right, you see the United States with relatively high social and economic and environmental problems. There are other differences. More equal societies innovate more. They spend more on overseas aid and they do better on the Global Peace Index. But more unequal societies are far more likely to go to war. This is the range of inequality across 20 countries. Here we have Japan, where the richest 20% of the population is just 3.4 times wealthier than the poorest 20%. And on the right, the ratio for the United States is 8.5. In South Africa, the richest 20% of households earns 38 times what the poorest 20% earns. Figures are slightly different because the earlier figures were for individuals, but these are for households. But in fact, because poor income households are generally bigger, this actually hides some difference. We do have social grants in South Africa which offset this to some degree, but not nearly enough. So that's what that ratio looks like on the graph we saw a moment ago. South Africa is probably the most unequal country in the world. We're certainly the most unequal country in the G20, and our developing country peers like Brazil and China and India are actually managing to decrease their inequality at the moment. Although in the last 20 years of our democracy, we've seen an increase in inequality amongst blacks and amongst whites within those populations, overall the gap between whites and blacks, despite our past, has barely narrowed, if at all. And all this is happening in a very particular context of increasing global environmental destruction. Each year we now use 50% more water, soil, fresh air, wood, and carbon storage than the Earth can sustainably provide. You may ask how we can use more than is available, but it's a bit like running a ship that is running out of fuel by starting to tear up the decks and feeding those into the boilers. Except the decks that we're destroying in this case are soils and species and forests and whole ecosystems to keep our civilization going in the way that it is. So the only sane solution in a situation like this is for us to consume less and to share more. Inequality has the function of fueling unnecessary consumerism. because people in highly unequal societies tend to compete for status on the basis of visible consumption. Inequality makes it much harder, the statistics show, to gain support for policies to reduce global warming. All this contributes to destroying the world that our children should be inheriting, and this is creating a situation of intergenerational inequality. Inequality also makes nonsense of our political and human rights ideals. I have a friend who works for the municipality of a small town in the Southern Cape. She's responsible for wealthy retired communities and townships, where the infrastructure is far more rudimentary. Where do you think she gets the most phone calls from? Not from the township. The fact is that to have real political influence in this world, you have to have access to information and communications and transport and to real social networks, bringing people together and uniting them for a purpose, whether it's starting a business or a political movement or a union. All this takes access to resources. Political power on paper means nothing without access to resources. The conventional economic of the wisdom of the last 30 years for poverty reduction is that you sell off the commons to private enterprise, the magic of private enterprise grows the economy, and everyone benefits. Except that this doesn't seem to be working very well for us and for a lot of other countries. So between the years 2006 and 2009, as workers' remuneration went up 15.4%, chief executives in South Africa raced ahead with raises of over 200%. Experts who talk about inequality are generally very comfortable talking about poverty reduction. They are rather more shy when it comes to talking about wealth reduction. But we have to understand an uncomfortable and painful truth, which is that extreme wealth can, and very often does, actually destroy the prosperity of others. People are very rarely naturally poor. All too often they are poor because they've been shoved aside by the powerful, by apartheid, by war, by the climate change effects of the carbon emissions of the wealthy, and in a recent trend, land grabs by Western corporations to grow food for countries that are increasingly under pressure in their own environments. The best recent example of wealth destroying, of course, is the recent global financial crisis, caused by greed, recklessness, and the criminal abuse of the global financial system. There's one study that's been done that estimates that the highest paid city bankers destroy 7 pounds of social value for every pound of financial value they create. Perhaps by now you agree that inequality is a very serious problem, and that throwing more money and power to those who already have it is not going to solve it. So how do we solve it? The simplest, most obvious way to reduce inequality is to have higher tax rates, to finance better public services, particularly education and healthcare. In countries with superb health and education, like Denmark and Sweden, top tax rates are close to 60%. And people pay those taxes happily. Even the United States and the UK have had far higher tax rates in the past. They're more equally socially stable pasts. In the United States now and in Europe, there are many millionaires saying, tax us more. But here in South Africa, the rich largely remain silent. If there are any millionaires in the audience, you could start a social movement right here. So, there is such a thing as too much money and too much power. Let's set a maximum wage. But there are many other measures that we can take. One means of doing this is to constrain the ratios between the maximum and minimum wages in particular companies. 100 years ago in J.P. Morgan, right there at the dark heart of capitalism, the great investment bank had its foundation. The founder, John Q. Morgan, insisted that the highest paid person in the company, in the bank, could never earn more than 20 times what the lowest paid person was. Compare that to the global financial crisis, where the chief executives that led us into so much trouble earned in some instances 1,000 times more than their lowest paid employees. In Japan, managers just earn less. And when hard times come along, rather than laying off workers, very often they cut their own wages. John Lewis, the man who came up with this phrase, is the founder of a great company in the United Kingdom called John Lewis Department Stores. It has 70,000 employees. Every single one is an owner of that company. They have great employee benefits. They get great annual bonuses. People work there for far longer. And it's this model of employee ownership and cooperative ownership and what has now been evolved in the United States, public benefit corporations, are all fantastic alternatives to the corporate structures that we are so familiar with. And they're more stable structures. And we need tax incentives to encourage people to set up companies like that. But there are other ways that we can look at. In the great socialist paradise of Alaska, every citizen gets a check every year, their share of royalties on the state's mineral resources, particularly oil. Last year it was $1,100. Here in South Africa, we've been exporting our great mineral wealth for 150 years, and I still haven't seen a check. Cap and share is another idea, a proposal that would force fossil fuel companies to buy the rights to pollute from every citizen, cutting carbon emissions and boosting equality at a stroke. Of course, we need a foundation of renewed governance for this. In Norway, Finland, and Sweden, everyone's tax returns are public. You can see where the money is going. Here in South Africa, we also need to open up the finances of our political parties and have an electoral system that makes our politicians more accountable to us. But we need more than that. We need institutions that bring us together again. Part of the benefits of good public services is not just that they provide the services in question, but that they unite these. People go and share together. The MIT economist, Doron Asimoglu, has shown that it's when nations succeed when they have these inclusive institutions and fail when those institutions start to fall apart. Pravin Gordhan, our own South African finance minister, has warned that the instability and revolution that we've seen in North Africa over the last year has been in very large part fueled by the kind of youth unemployment and instability that we have right here at home, and that we need to seriously start looking at these problems. Well, what about the rich? What happens to them in a society with more equality? Well, our epidemiologists, Wilkinson and Pickett, have shown that the poor in Scandinavia, Holland, and Japan are actually better off than the rich in the most unequal countries. In other words, greater equality is better for everyone. The rich in a more equal society may have less money in their pockets, but their children will be less vulnerable to crime, less vulnerable to addiction, less vulnerable to depression, and their grandchildren may get to escape global ecological collapse. The suggestions I'm making here are not an attempt at erasing all social distinction or at creating a utopia. They are all suggestions that in most instances have been tried already elsewhere in the world. There are very successful societies that have successfully cultivated high levels of equality. Some years ago, I was working on HIV documentaries. We were filming in a desperately poor part of Limpopo province, Burgersfort. And I was interviewing a woman who had been raped, had HIV, and lived in a little tin box on a hillside. We're all used to seeing shacks in Cape Town, but shacks in Cape Town are often palaces compared to shacks in Burgersfort. And while we were talking to her, she did this kind of double take. And we asked her what was happening. And she said, "The man who raped me, he just walked behind you." I've been talking about technical solutions, but I don't think those are enough alone to resolve our inequality crisis. I think another step is required, that we all decide in our own hearts that we no longer want to live in a society where some people have to live no more than a few dozen meters away from somebody who raped them. I would like to live in a South Africa where the inequality, where nobody has to suffer that kind of indignity and anxiety. I'm sure the same goes for you. And as I've shown, there are a great many ways to accomplish this. Let's do it. Let's acknowledge how destructive too much wealth can be. And let's have the vision to understand how creative it can be when it's shared. Let's campaign for a maximum wage. Thank you.